have Judge Ajjan, an international election strategist, and Michael Famoroti, the head of intelligence and co-founder at Stears. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, gentlemen. Let me first start with the election strategist, which is Judge. Judge, looking at what we've seen so far play out today in the build-up to the elections, how are you calling this?
Sorry, Ken, can you repeat the last bit?
How are you calling the elections here?
Well, it's been a shock for me having been outside Nigeria for the presidential election for the first time in quite a while. And there's all of the buzz about Peter Obi has frankly been shocking to me, and I'm really excited to see how that plays out. My instinct as a political strategist would probably be to say that his strength is being over-exaggerated, simply because it's very difficult to translate youth enthusiasm into actual votes and organization, because there's really three things that go into three key components that go into a victory. One is the ideas of the candidate. Two is an organization that can deliver those ideas, and third is money to fund that organization. You really need all three of those things. He's clearly got the ideas because he's been able to motivate so many people. What's unclear is all of that social media activity and all of that buzz amongst Nigerian expatriates and diaspora, does that translate into actual votes on the ground and people actually turning up to vote in all 36 states?
And I was wondering if you've been tracking any of the polls out, and I guess polls only suggest what's possible, but then many of them are pointing to a huge chunk of undecided voters who could tilt this. And I was wondering, what do you think would, what are we likely to see with those undecided voters in terms of their action today?
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge. When I look at what's being reported, I mean the polling results or the predictions are all over the place. There's some saying that Peter Obi, who from an outside party, is going to have 2/3 of the vote, and the two major parties are going to have picking up the scraps. I mean that seems wildly unrealistic to me. Others show more traditional kind of result that we might expect. So it's really hard to say, and I think all of us are just sitting here waiting to see, as the votes are counted in the coming days, what actually ends up happening. But regardless of all that, this is a success. I mean, the fact that there's been two main parties, and that a third force has come into play. You could argue potentially a fourth with Kwankwaso, but anyway, let's just say the fact that Obi has been so monumental in throwing this race into turmoil in terms of what we might expect, that's a big success for Nigerian democracy. So I'm really optimistic about that.
Let me bring in Michael here, because I think Michael might disagree with you on some of your options here, as according to how their polls suggest. And Michael, let me get your take on things to respond to some of the things that Judge has just said, and also how you're reading this now, and how what we're seeing on ground now today compares to what your polls suggested.
Yeah, thanks, Wale. I think generally I broadly agree with George's comments. Polling is very new science and very new industry in Nigeria, and there's quite a lot of diversity in terms of the rigor put into different polls. And I think Stears was the only pollster that attempted to untangle the silent voter problem, which essentially makes all other polls inconclusive when you look at those numbers. I think the other thing to point out is the polls have pointed something very clearly, and that is that Peter Obi is the most universally popular candidate. Now, whether or not that translates into him winning, as George said, would largely depend on voter turnout, specifically the spread of voter turnout across regions and age. I guess people have started voting, and we're keeping our eyes glued to the TV to transport trends. But I think until we have a clearer picture of the spread of voter turnout, it is very difficult to call what's going to happen.
Let me bring Bismarck here in case you want to ask a question or respond to some of the things that have been said.
I think I hear what George is saying. I see what Michael is saying as well. The ground game and the organization is extremely important, because this is quite a rudimentary society. So all this enthusiasm and all this broadband and all this social media is one thing. Getting the ground game and showing your agents make sure that the votes are cast in the way they want it done is another thing altogether. And what most of the polls were taken before the cash crisis. If you build in the cash crisis, which means there's a loss of confidence in the currency of the country, right? And the velocity of circulation has dropped so sharply. So what does that mean to an individual? Is he voting because he cannot get cash? Is he voting against the policy that brought about the cash? Does that confuse his understanding of who is government, who is the party, and what next? Or is this all stacked against me? And will this make me not turn out, not turn up to vote? So I think it's a bit, first of all, there's an inconsistency between the polls and the basic traditional voting pattern of people. And secondly, all of these exogenous variables, the shocks that have come because of petrol, because of cash, and now because of every other thing that is there. Are these normal times? And are you going to get normal responses from the people? That's my problem.
Okay, let me bring George and Michael to respond to this one, because now, picking up on what Bismarck said about the traditional patterns of voting, religion and ethnicity have been two major factors that influenced how people have voted over the years. And I'd like you to speak to how much that could play in this particular poll today. Let me start with George and then get Michael.
Well, that's a big concern. I mean, when you have this traditional dichotomy of Christian Muslim and the idea that the ticket needs to be split and the zoning and all of that's gone out the window in this election. And so you have Peter Obi as the uniquely Christian candidate amongst the top three. That obviously plays into his favor. On the other hand, now he hasn't overtly embrace that. There may be some sort of dog whistle aspects of that, okay, if you're a good Christian, you'll vote for Peter Obi. But that can have a backlash as well, because if there are young people that, in the North, for example, Muslims in other parts of the country that might be inclined to support Peter Obi for the reasons that other young people are supporting him, but then they feel that, but he's just there and all the right, very hardline Christians are coming behind Peter Obi, that can hurt him amongst people who are Muslim and consider that as a prominent part of their identity, but otherwise are disappointed with the choices they have amongst their own co-religionists.
Michael?
Yeah, I think I'll make it very simple. Religion will determine Nigeria's 2023 presidential elections in either of two ways. Either the status quo persists and Nigerians will continue to vote along religious lines. So, for example, in the Stears poll, only 3% of Muslims said that they would vote for Peter Obi, despite the fact that he was the most popular candidate nationwide, right? Only 17% of Christians opted for a Muslim candidate. So people are clearly even saying they will vote by religious lines. So if that status quo continues, then it's essentially just a question of how many Muslims or Muslims come out. The caveat is the high level of silent voters and the tensions in religion make you wonder to what extent those silent voters are essentially people planning to buck that religion trend. Now, if we see enough of that happening, then again, in the favor of whoever that falls for. I mean, there's been a lot of conversations around to what extent Peter Obi can get 25% in at least a few northern states. That is required to, even if he gets the popular vote. So if we do see a number of Muslims in those states bucking the traditional religion trend, then Peter Obi suddenly has a clearer path to victory. But I do think that essentially just following religion tells you so much of what you need to know about the Nigerian presidential elections.
Let me
Michael,
just add to what,
let's talk about...
what Michael...
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Charles.
I wanted to add just to what he said. The interesting
George, right?
bit that lends further credence to what he's saying is that neither of the two Muslim candidates are compelling by themselves. They are with parties. They represent some kind of idea or a way of running the country. Peter Obi is the only one. It just happens that he happens to be the Christian candidate. He's the one that has a personality that's compelling to people. There's nobody who's a diehard Tinubu guy or a diehard Atiku guy. I mean, Atiku has tried so many times. Okay, he represents the PDP. He represents a certain machine. Tinubu really represents a machine, a certain way of running the country, representing the APC and the continuity of that. But Obi is the guy who inspires people. The others are not inspiring.
All right. Coming back to you, Michael, what are the swing states or swing scenarios, if we can put it that way, that you think could tilt this thing? Because, as you rightly pointed out, going by history, there is a certain way that most Nigerians would vote along religious and ethnic lines. But are there any things that you're looking out for in these elections that could swing things?
Yeah, I think because it's a three-way race, because each party and each candidate has a base in different parts of the country, there are quite a number of states to watch for. I mean, just by sheer size and the fact that votes are likely going to be split there more than any other state, Kano is a really interesting one. I think Kano is a bellwether for how the PDP and APC do generally. If one of them don't hit the 25% mark in Kano, which is possible, that really is a blow to their national chances. So Kano is a real big one for me. Obviously, as always, the North Central states are seen as strong signals. Kwara, Kogi, Plateau. Those at the moment seem to have more clear front runners, but even still, they're not all singing from the same hymn sheet, which is a bit unusual. And I think finally, probably the region that is hardest to call is the Northeast. You would expect the PDP and APC to do quite well there, but at the same time, and this takes us back to the polls, a number of the polls are showing a stronger than expected Peter Obi performance in the Northeast. Again, for those states, he doesn't even need to win because he essentially has a lot of the southern states in the bag, and it's really just a case of how, I guess, how many states he can even get the 25% mark in. And I think that's really the question that we're often forgetting, that may even determine, what a potential runoff could look like.
All right, let me get Brisbane back in there. Brisbane, you want to comment or ask a question?
No, I don't think any of them have answered the question as what is the impact of the cash crunch? Because those polls were taken before the cash crisis came. Is it going to make it break more towards a particular set of candidates, or is it going to make them break more towards their traditional voting pattern?
It's a great point because it's more like pressure just before the elections.
Absolutely.
How does it influence your view of the candidates? And I think what's different here is
like
that
the FBI opening up investigation on Hillary Clinton 4 days before the election, and then that changed everything.
And then, of course, in this case, we do not have the incumbent on the ballot. So let's maybe start with George. George, your thoughts on this?
Point here. And you're right, we should have addressed that. I would say it represents, from looking at the situation and the way that the candidates are responding to it, I think it's a shortcoming strategically on the part of all the candidates to not have come out with a plan to really reassure people that we're going to fix this cash crunch. I don't see that coming from anywhere. It's just something that's we accept it as if as everyone accepts this is the unfortunate situation we are in. No one says, here's my plan to fix it immediately within the first 90 days of my presidency. I think that's been lacking. On the other hand, you could look at something, a bit of a conspiracy saying, well, this is to the advantage, having a cash crunch is to the advantage of the establishment parties, particularly the APC, particularly Tinubu, because they have presumably cash stashed away, and that becomes the walking around money for the election. When there's a cash crunch, that enables them to engage in vote buying more easily than others. So those are, I would say, the two things that come to my mind when we talk about the impact of the cash crunch in the election.
Michael?
Yeah, so I would first of all point out that there's a practical constraint here, in that I do think that in between the cash crunch and the petrol scarcity, um, we may see a bit of a hit to voter turnout. Some say that where there's a will, there's a way, but there are practical realities that may prevent people from going out to vote. So starting from there, I think because the Labour Party candidate is riding on an expectation of a higher than normal turnout, he is then vulnerable to people not being able to go out to vote. But the second part of it is, for everybody that does go out, I think in the last few weeks, especially, my assessment is that there has been more solidifying in terms of anger against the present government. Now, just because the APC candidate, despite their attempts over the last few weeks to distance themselves from the current government, they are still seen as continuity. I think, again, they haven't come out of this period looking very well. And I think the PDP would also have suffered a bit, because generally the sentiment is our established government and parties are making us suffer, and we want to change them. So I think it would help a lot of the Labour Party voters and may have actually swung people to his side. That said, it's a question of if the practical effects outweigh the fact that people probably see him more positively after this cash crisis.
All right, very interesting point there by Michael there. Bismarck, I'd like you to speak to that because, yes, the APC has been in power for 8 years. It's the first time Nigerians tasted this political party for first administration. In 2019, we had another election, January 1. And now we're seeing where we are right now as a nation. And how much do you think people are going to look and say, wait here? Should we give this party another try here?
Very difficult. Theoretically and technically, if you have the misery index increasing consecutively for 3 quarters to an election, the incumbent party is always in trouble. We've seen that everywhere in the world. 1. 2, it depends on how angry you have got. If you are very, very angry, you will go straight all the way to the Labour Party. If you are moderately angry and frustrated, you break out for the PDP. So I see, 1, the cash crisis hurting the APC to some extent. And if you are already at the edge, it pushes you all the way to Labour. If you are somewhere in the middle, maybe, based on traditional, you will probably stay PDP and Labour. So it chips a little bit away from the APC, but it breaks out fully for PDP and Labour Party.
It's been quite an interesting conversation. I want to say thank you to our guests, George Ajjan, an international election strategist, and of course, Michael Famoroti, head of intelligence and co-founder of Stears.